All right, welcome everyone to our October student seminar for the Pitt chapter of AWM. Today we'll be welcoming in our first talk Niamh Fennelly from the University College of Dublin, and she'll be talking to us about her models on mean field approximations. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thank you so much for having me. So yes, hello everybody. Thanks so much for coming to hear my talk. I suppose I'll just launch straight in. So my project that I'll be talking about here is mean field approximation for a network with synchrony-driven adaptive coupling. And I worked on this project with Alana Neff, Renaud Lambiot, Andrew Keane, and my supervisor here in UCD, Anya Byrne. So this is just an overview of what I'll be talking about today. But my research is in mathematical neuroscience, and I'm aware that I've been invited here by another mathematical neuroscientist, and there is a big lab in University of Pittsburgh OVU. But just in case there's anyone here who isn't as familiar with the neuroscience side of things, I just wanted to start with some brief biological background. So, whether they're familiar to you or not, you probably have heard of neurons. So, these cells are the fundamental building blocks of the brain. There's approximately 86 billion of them in the human brain, and they communicate by sending and receiving electrical signals called action potentials or spikes. And these spikes travel across connections called synapses. And there's extensive experimental evidence showing that the strength of synapses is not fixed. It's elastic, it changes dynamically in response to neural activity, in response to the sending and receiving of these spikes. And this process is called synaptic plasticity. And it's the key mechanism behind learning and memory formation in the brain. So, the mechanism of these changes was first proposed by Donald Hebb in 1949 and has since been refined into what we now call spike timing dependent plasticity, or STDP for short. So he proposed that the increase or decrease in synaptic strength that we see was related to the relative timings of spikes, and he famously summarized this theory with the phrase cells that fire together wire together. So, modeling long term plasticity in a mathematically tractable way is the focus of my PhD. And in this talk, I will be discussing how I have introduced a biologically motivated form of plasticity into a mathematical neural model with the aim of, excuse me, better capturing how learning mechanisms shape collective neural dynamics. So, as mentioned, to study the brain mathematically, we need a model, and there are many to choose from. So at the single cell level, we can use a model that tracks the voltage of individual neurons as they spike. A very biophysically realistic example of this being the Hodgkin-Huxley model, which is shown here in pink. This system uses 4 ODEs to intricately model the ionic currents involved in the spiking of a single neuron. In contrast, another potential option is the quadratic integrate and fire model, which is shown here in purple, or there's actually many integrate and fire models in the family, all of which include less detail and instead just insert a generic action potential shape. But we can see that when it's tuned to data, it still manages to match the Hodgkin-Huxley model and the spiking behavior very well. So both are two of many good options at the single neuron level. However, we're often more interested in large populations of neurons and how they interact with each other, and even the simpler models we have here are very computationally expensive when we couple up thousands or tens of thousands of them to form a network. So instead of tracking each one, we turn to neural mass models. And these use a single equation to describe the average activity of a population being studied. So, for example, this figure represents the commonly used Wilson-Cowan model, which just uses 2 equations, one for an excitatory population and one for an inhibitory population, to model the interactions between those. And these types of models they're much more simple to analyze than a large network of neuron models, but they're also more abstract, removed from biology. Their parameters don't necessarily have a direct biological counterpart. So a recent popular method of bridging this gap from the microscopic to the mesoscopic is to use mean field models. So the idea of mean field theory is to describe a large network statistically rather than going neuron by neuron. So we start with a network of our more biologically realistic neuron models coupled together, and under certain assumptions, we derive a probability density function for the system. And then from this description, we can pull equations for a few collective quantities. So a common one is the average firing rate of the neurons. These are dubbed next generation neural mass models, and they preserve some of that biological detail from the underlying neuron model at the population level, giving us a model that balances efficiency and realism. And this is what I'm going to be doing with my model today. So going backwards again, the underlying neuron model that I use for my networks is called the theta neuron model. And it's mathematically equivalent to the quadratic integrating fire that we saw before. But instead of tracking the voltage over time, it instead tracks the phase as we evolve around a circle. This makes the dynamics continuous and easier to work with. So the first equation describes how each neuron's phase, theta, evolves over time. Each neuron has its own intrinsic background drive, intrinsic frequency, eta, and these are drawn from a Lorentzian distribution, which introduces heterogeneity into the network, meaning all of the neurons aren't the same. Vsin is the synaptic reversal potential, so this is the voltage that has to be exceeded in a neuron for it to release a spike. And our second equation here, it describes the synaptic conductance, S. And this increases instantaneously when any phase hits pi, which is what we use to represent a spike. It decays exponentially with parameter tau S. And this increase here is scaled by the coupling strength K, which determines how strongly neurons influence each other, how much of the spike they're receiving or how much of that input they're getting. And in traditional theta neuron models, this is fixed, it's a constant, but later in my work, I'm going to be modeling this dynamically. So in this framework, a larger K would correspond to a stronger synaptic connection, so spikes from other neurons will have a greater impact, while a smaller K would mean a weaker transmission of those inputs and a weaker connection. A major advantage of using this theta neuron model is that as a phase oscillator, we get to use a metric called the Kerr-Motor order parameter to measure the synchrony of the neurons. So if we imagine each of the colored dots here is a neuron evolving around this circle, then the Kerr-Motor order parameter looks at the average of all of their phases, psi, and their average, the overall synchrony of the system, or. So or is represented visually here as the length of the line in the circle. When it's close to 0, the neurons are almost entirely asynchronous. When or is close to 1, they're almost entirely synchronized. So we have our chosen model, and we want to incorporate plasticity through the coupling strength term. But we need to decide how to model that plasticity. So we look a little more in depth at the biology involved. So spike timing dependent plasticity has two commonly studied forms. There's causal STDP and symmetric STDP. So causal STDP is the most widely observed, and it refers to asymmetric learning, where the direction of communication is important. So if we imagine a path or a connection from neuron 1 to neuron 2, if neuron 1 fires before neuron 2, that is, if delta t is positive, we're in this region here, then the synapse between them is strengthened through a process called long-term potentiation, or LTP. Conversely, if neuron 2 fired before neuron 1, then the connection from neuron 1 to neuron 2 is weakened. And this is a process called long-term depression, or LTD. And of course, the size of this change depends on how close in time the spikes are. The closer they are, the stronger the effect. So as we move away from 0 in either direction, the effect is lessened. And this timing asymmetry is critical in many learning tasks. So we also see symmetric STDP biologically, and the symmetric curve looks like this. So in this case, it's not the order of the spikes that matters, but only their proximity in time. So when spikes are close together, regardless of which comes first, the synapse is potentiated, it's strengthened. And as the timing gap widens, the effect lessens until it actually flips to depression and over time again becomes negligible. So this type of learning is more correlation based than causal, and it's thought to support different kinds of information processing. In this project, we're using a phase oscillator model, the theta model, which tracks the evolution of phases rather than time. And so to model plasticity, we approximate our time-dependent plasticity with a phase difference-dependent plasticity rule, or PDDP for short. And as the name suggests, this approximates it by a function of the phase difference. So both causal and symmetric SGDP can be approximated by PDDP, and these rules have been recently validated in a network of Kuramoto oscillators. So in this work, we're incorporating them into a more biologically realistic theta neuron network. Specifically, in this project, we focused on symmetric SGDP, and we captured this shape with a cosine-based rule. So moving on to the model description. So as I mentioned, each neuron is modeled by the standard theta neuron equation, and we explored two ways of implementing our phase difference dependent plasticity to the model. So the first being a pairwise update rule, where every individual neuron pair has its own coupling strength that adapts according to the cosine of the phase difference between that specific pair of neurons. In addition to this, we also considered an approximation, a second network where all synapses evolve according to a single global update rule. We derived this by averaging the pairwise rule across the entire network, and we found that this could be expressed in terms of the Kuramoto order parameter that I mentioned earlier, giving us a global plasticity rule where coupling strength evolves based on the overall synchrony of the network. In other words, rather than adjusting individual connections based on pairwise phase differences, this rule updates all synapses collectively in proportion to the degree of synchrony, aligning nicely with that cells that fire together, wire together principle. In both of these rules, epsilon is the timescale and alpha is, it controls the strength of plasticity relative to its decay. So finally, we move on to that mean field approximation. So we apply what's called the Otten-Thomson ansatz to our networks, and through this, we derive the following mean field approximation of the system. In doing this, we are assuming a single population of oscillators with all-to-all coupling and a Lorentzian distribution of intrinsic drives. So in basic English, we're assuming that we're only ever modeling one population at a time. Every neuron in that population is directly connected to every other neuron in that population. And we're pulling the frequencies, the intrinsic frequencies of all of these individual neurons from a Lorentzian or Cauchy distribution. And the result is this three-dimensional system. So we have an equation for the evolution of the order parameter Z, tracking the average synchrony of the population over time. And this is in terms of e to 0, which is the mean of our Lorentzian distribution, delta, which is the full width at half maximum of that distribution, introducing the heterogeneity, and V sin, which is our reversal potential from before. We also have an equation for the average synaptic conductance S over time, and we note this term here, f of z, is the average firing rate. And finally, we have the mean synaptic coupling strength, k hat, which we can see is in fact equivalent to our global update rule. So in summary, we have three systems of equations, two theta neuron networks, one with a pairwise update rule, one with a global synchrony-based rule, and we have a mean field approximation for the system in terms of the order parameter Z, which also uses the global update rule to track the average coupling strength. So we now move on to validating our mean field model against these networks. So we examine simulations of our two theta neuron networks with 1,000 neurons each and our mean field. And we look at them in three qualitatively distinct dynamical regimes for a number of parameters. So we move from one regime to the next by varying the mean intrinsic drive of the neurons, the e to zero. Starting with the most straightforward of our regimes, when e to 0 is equal to -5, the system tends to a stable node. We're examining this as the Kuramoto order parameter, the average coupling strength, synchrony, and conductance over time, and this here is the distribution of the coupling weights for the pairwise network. So in this regime, the networks quickly settle into a high coherence quiescent state, appearing as a stable node in the mean field phase portrait. So although some neurons may spike due to the long tail of the Lorentzian distribution, their effect on the overall dynamics is negligible. The bulk of the population is remaining near rest, it's not spiking. And what we see here is that all three models track each other extremely closely. The mean field is providing a good match for either of the networks. Looking at the distribution of the pairwise coupling weights, we also see they're clearly unimodal, satisfying the assumption of our mean field of that single population. When we increase e to 0 to 10, the system shifts to a stable spiral regime. And this corresponds to an active population with low synchrony. So neurons are firing at different phases with some weak correlations, but no coherent synchronized oscillation. The spiraling of the order parameter represents how the mean phase of the population evolves over time before settling to a fixed point with moderate synchrony. And this reduced synchrony, indicates there is greater heterogeneity in the phases. And consequently, the dynamics of our networks with local and global updates begin to diverge from each other. Despite this divergence, the network with global updates still closely matches the mean field dynamics, so the mean field is still providing a good approximation for that network. However, the local update network, the pairwise update, is diverging. The distribution actually of the pairwise update is becoming bimodal, which suggests that the oscillators in this network may be forming clusters and thus are no longer adhering to that single population assumption of our mean field. However, even though the pairwise network does diverge and its mean coupling strength is higher, the Kuramoto order parameter still fluctuates around the mean field fixed point value. And it's particularly apparent here. We can see that it is fluctuating around the same value. So although they're not a good approximation for each other, it's not completely off. And the final regime we looked at was when we increased e to 0 further to 25, and the system undergoes a Hopf bifurcation, and we get a limit cycle in the order parameter. So this corresponds to periodic synchrony. From a neural activity standpoint, we're seeing oscillations at the population level with neurons moving in and out of synchrony with each other. So again, the mean field model and the global update network remain closely aligned, while the pairwise update model diverges significantly. And again, we see the distribution of the coupling weights here appears to be bimodal, suggesting clustering and suggesting that it's just not satisfying the assumptions of our mean field anymore. So although the global update model and the mean field are very similar, we did notice some variation across different realizations of the network model. And this was largely due to the randomly sampled nature of the E to J's, the intrinsic background drives, when they were drawn from the distribution. And the variability is illustrated in these plots of the coupling strength over time. So we have 15 different realizations, so those are the transparent lines, and their means, which are the solid lines. And we've shown them for the three different dynamical regimes. So this is our stable node, stable spiral, stable limit cycle. And we've shown that also for three different population sizes. So 500, 1000, and 2000 neurons. And what we note is that as the network size increases, the variability decreases, and the network dynamics converge, or the global network dynamics at least, converge towards those of the mean field. So we could also have reduced variability further by making the neurons more homogeneous, so narrowing the variance or the delta parameter. But what we noted that that would do is it also makes the network more prone to synchrony. It changes the qualitative behavior of the dynamics. So we chose to allow for this variability and yeah, just the limit of the population size as it increases, the variability decreases. But interestingly, we did also find that oscillatory regimes show more variability across realizations rather than the quiescent ones. So even the regime type influences how sensitive the system is to these background variations. And overall, this validation kind of showed us that while the pairwise update model can't be captured by the mean field, the global update network can be used as a meaningful intermediary between the two. Okay, so moving on to some analysis of the mean field. Something else was actually highlighted to us by this variability across realizations. When we were comparing the dynamics of the mean field system to the network with global updates for certain parameters, we observed these jumps in the network simulations away from the mean field dynamics. And these transitions pointed to the presence of another attractor in the system, a stable fixed point, alongside the limit cycle that we had been looking at. And what was happening is that those finite size fluctuations could push the network out of the basin of attraction of the limit cycle and into that of the fixed point. This effect was more pronounced for smaller networks. So, for example, in networks of size n equals to 500, which is this light blue, it occurred for about 80% of realizations that they transferred to the fixed point. But when we increased that size to n equals to 1,000, the number dropped to 30%, which is this over here. So this next section of work was largely led by my collaborators, but I'll do my best to do it justice. So we performed a preliminary bifurcation analysis of the system, only really looking at two parameters. So the mean excitability, e to 0, as we noted that this parameter sort of sets the qualitative behavior of the system, and alpha, the synaptic strength, because we specifically are interested in how plasticity has influenced the dynamics. And what we found was that the inclusion of adaptivity greatly enriched the dynamics of the system. So here in this plot on the left, we see three bifurcation diagrams for the parameter e to 0. The first is a diagram of the maximum conductance S for the system without adaptivity. And the second is for the system, it's the same diagram, but for the system with plasticity. And very clearly, the dynamics are greatly enriched. We've gone from having only one hop bifurcation to having hop bifurcations, saddle node bifurcations, period doubling, and torus bifurcations. The bottom plot here shows the same adaptive system, but against the maximum coupling strength K. And in both of these plots, we can also observe that multi-stability that we saw before. So the blue lines indicate stable attractors, and we can clearly see there's multiple parameter values like here and here, where we have two stable attractors coexisting. We also continued some of these bifurcations against a second variable, alpha, and this is a two-parameter bifurcation diagram of e to 0 against alpha, the colored curves corresponding to the bifurcations of the same color in these other plots. So magenta line, that's the hop, these black lines are the period doubling, blue are the saddle node, and red are the torus bifurcations. And the shaded regions here indicate areas of chaotic behavior where we found the system had positive maximal Lyapunov exponents. So here, this is a result of a period doubling cascade, and here it's a result of overlapping Arnold tongues. So it's worth noting this analysis is not exhaustive. It's a focused look on how plasticity reshapes this phase space. And already we're seeing significant complexity emerging. However, there's a lot of scope for further bifurcation analysis of this system, so that's something that we're hoping to come back to at some stage if possible. So I actually don't know how I'm doing for time because I can't see a clock where I am, but hopefully I have a few minutes because I just wanted to squeeze in mentioning what I'm currently working on, which is so far we've looked at how plasticity shapes network dynamics over time, but of course the brain isn't evolving just over time, it has structure in space. So to capture that, my current work is looking at extending this model spatially. So very briefly overview of this, we do this by transforming our equations into PDEs that depend on both position as well as time, and by introducing a distance-weighted kernel, so to convolve with the firing rate. So this wizard's hat kernel excites nearby neurons while inhibiting those further away. And in this way, we're adding another layer of filtering to the spike input received from other neurons on top of that synaptic coupling strength filtering that we already have. So then using similar mean field techniques as before, we can reduce this spatial network to a neural field model. And we are interested in analyzing the model for pattern formation. So this is the results of a Turing instability analysis that we performed, and some of the patterns we found are just shown here, some examples. So we have some bumps and some modulated waves, and some of these have been linked to working memory, so they're particularly interesting to study from a plasticity perspective. So we're currently in the process of refining this model to make it more biologically realistic. So we're actually going back and workshopping our initial model and this mean field of it to see if we can improve the way that the plasticity is being described here by either changing our plasticity equation further or changing this distance weighting. So we're workshopping lots of things on that at the moment. So just to conclude, my research focuses on incorporating synaptic plasticity into mean field models of neural activity. We identified a global plasticity rule that can be approximated in a mean field framework. And we've shown that adding this plasticity fundamentally transforms the system, producing a richer bifurcation landscape with multi-stability and even chaotic dynamics. And in terms of future and ongoing projects, as I touched on just now, my current work extends this approach spatially. So I'm looking to continue this and analyze how plasticity influences spatial patterns. And looking ahead, I'm interested in exploring interactions between multiple neuron populations. So we discussed this pairwise update rule, but found that the network model was naturally forming clusters, breaking our single population assumption. But we think it would be interesting to explore this rule again, potentially in an extension with multiple populations to see if we could get around that issue. And finally, as I mentioned, our bifurcation analysis was not exhaustive, and it would be interesting to map the parameter space more thoroughly. So I'll leave it there. Just want to thank my collaborators, put all their faces up here, and if anyone's interested in reading our full paper, you can find it here. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll open the floor to any questions.